Well, President Xi Jinping has told the Chinese military it must transform into an elite force. He made the comments during a massive military parade which showcased Beijing's latest hardware. Professor John Blaxland is a senior fellow at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU's College of Asia and the Pacific. We spoke about what an elite force might look like.
When you think about what China's doing, it is trying to scale back from a mass army, the kind of the army of folklore of the Korean War, where you'd see waves, human waves of soldiers being, the mass number of soldiers was the weapon itself. Now the Chinese are looking to be much more sophisticated, and they've come a long way since the Korean War. But what we're facing now is this stressing of an elite force, and that is about trying to match the kinds of reforms that we've seen in Western militaries. And we've seen it in Australia as well, but particularly in the United States. This emphasis on special forces, on robust, highly networked, precision-guided munition-enabled forces with cyber support. Because what we're seeing is armed forces have gone from being analog forces to being much more digital forces, where they rely on communications that are about ones and zeros, a digital force that's connected through networks and computers, satellites and so on. That's great, and it really does enable you to do enormous amounts of things that you couldn't do before, but it also gives you enormous vulnerabilities. So this elite force is about making that networked force capable, raising the standards of the individual soldiers, reducing the size of the force, and then making that a more networked and enabled digital, what we in Australia are calling a fifth generation force. That is a networked and a highly technical force.
And John, in many ways, is it just catching up with what the rest of the world has been doing already, or is it something that we should be a bit concerned about?
It's definitely a catch-up game, but we're also seeing China act in a way that is surprising many pundits because of their forthright use of that information domain, in a way that has really caught a few people a little bit by surprise, because Western forces, particularly those US-influenced ones, have tended to have what they call a kinetic focus, an emphasis on warfighting capabilities, about firepower, missile strength, about range of weapons. China's been playing a game that's kind of on the twilight zone of what we would conventionally call warfare, and it's kind of stumping a lot of people, because what they're doing is they're operating short of that threshold that would trigger a military response. So we're seeing that in the cyber domain in terms of...
And give us an example of specific things that they are doing. I mean, is it like Russia hacking the US election, that kind of imposition on another country?
The capabilities are very much about focusing on the ability to interrupt the communications of field-deployed military forces, interrupting satellite communications, affecting the ability for aircraft to network communicate. And of course, that's something of considerable significance for us. In the Australian context, we have an air force that is touting an emphasis on being networked, being fifth generation, being reliant on communications through satellites and nodes between aircrafts, using the aircraft as essentially ICT nodes, That's great, and if that works under challenging circumstances, that's terrific. But of course, what we're seeing is China looking to operate in a domain where it can challenge our ability to operate like that and protect itself. And that's what's making this idea of an elite force being more than just special forces, but about a robust, modernised, hardened in the traditional sense of having metal plate protecting you, but also hardened electronically to be able to resist the electronic attack from a Growler aircraft or some other offensive electronic weaponry that the United States or its allies might want to operate.
John, while we're talking, I'm interested in your response to the US's kind of washing its hands of North Korea, saying this is China's business, they need to sort it out, they're the ones that have the capability. Do they? Can they bring North Korea to task? Well,
look, on one level, this is a kind of a clever way of trying to back themselves out of a corner, because they have been saying that the strategic patience is over, but by deflecting it and saying, look, it's really China's problem, China has to deal with it, then of course you're allowing President Trump and the US administration a little bit more wiggle room, because we know that they actually don't have a viable strategy, short of essentially thermonuclear war, which no one is seriously contemplating. Even American planners really aren't seriously contemplating doing that. Essentially, what it boils down to is that there aren't any good options. All of them, as soon as you cross that kinetic threshold, that threshold of using violent firepower against the adversary, or they use it against you, then where do you stop? And it's pretty much a bottomless pit. And essentially, there's no way of containing that the fallout if you are seriously presenting an existential threat to the North Korean regime, because then they can pull all the stops out and go like hell for leather against US forces in South Korea, US forces in Japan, and in due course, when they get this ICBM missile working properly, perhaps in the United States as well.
Great to talk as always, John. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much for having me on the show, Beverly.